AIAH was a simple man, dressed in clothes worn by time, walking through the streets of Shiloh, a small town but one with a giant mark on the history of Israel. There was nothing about him that caught the eye at first glance. He had no titles, no fame, no great achievements that anyone could point to and say, "Look, there's the chosen one." But that was precisely where the mystery lay. God has always had a habit of taking ordinary people and turning them into spokesmen for heaven. Ahab was born in Shiloh, a place known for having been the home of the Ark of the Covenant for many years. That city had seen a lot: victories, defeats, and above all, the abandonment of the divine presence when the people began to stray. It was in this setting, marked by ups and downs, that Ahijah grew up, learned to hear the voice of God, and became a prophet. Not because he sought this position, but because God had a specific plan, and Ahijah accepted it without hesitation. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. What was most impressive about Ahijah was not only his courage to say what needed to be said, but the way he did it. He didn't limit himself to words. He used gestures, powerful images, everything to make it clear that the message was not his, but God's. And one of those gestures ended up marking his life forever: the story of the torn cloak, a piece of cloth that became a symbol of something much greater. The time in which Ahijah lived was like a powder keg, just waiting for a spark to explode. Solomon, that king famous for his wisdom and riches, was already at the end of his life. But his reign was no longer the bed of roses that many people imagined. Behind the golden palaces and grandiose projects, the people groaned under the weight of exorbitant taxes. And that wasn't all. Solomon, who started out well, let himself be led astray by the foreign gods of his many wives. Little by little, Israel became filled with pagan altars, carved images, and practices that directly offended the God who had brought the people out of Egypt with a mighty hand. This tense environment created a strange atmosphere in the streets. It was as if everyone felt that something bad was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. The people began to question. Rumors of discontent grew, and in the midst of it all, there was a man whom God was already positioning to be the spark of a giant change: Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a hard worker, a natural leader who had caught Solomon's attention. The king even put him in charge of major projects, trusting in his ability. But Jeroboam also had a restless spirit, as if he sensed that his destiny was greater than just serving the king. And guess who God chose to give him the most surprising news of his life? Yes, Ahijah himself. The meeting between these two was no accident. A simple moment in an open field was about to turn into a scene full of symbolism and mystery. Jeroboam was walking alone in the field, probably thinking about his life, the challenges he faced and the responsibilities he carried. Perhaps he had no idea that this day would be anything but ordinary. Suddenly, there was Ahijah coming toward him. The two met far from prying eyes, without an audience, without ceremony. Just the two of them, the wind and the invisible weight of what was about to happen. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak, still made of sturdy, unworn fabric, something rare by the standards of the time. And without saying much, he did something totally unexpected. He took off his cloak, and before Jeroboam's watchful eyes, began to tear it into pieces. 1, 2, 3, until 12 pieces lay there, scattered on the ground. The sound of the fabric tearing seemed to echo across the field, as if each tear cut not only the cloth, but also the destiny of Israel. Then Ahijah took 10 pieces and gave them to Jeroboam. Imagine the scene: Jeroboam standing there, holding those torn pieces, not quite understanding what it all meant. Then Ahijah explained in a firm voice that left no room for doubt. God was giving 10 tribes to Jeroboam to rule. The kingdom of Israel, so united until then, would be divided. Solomon would keep a small part out of love for David, his father, but the rest, it was in Jeroboam's hands. But the warning came with a heavy responsibility. God made it clear that this was not just an opportunity for power, it was a test of loyalty. Jeroboam would have to walk in the right paths, obey, and be a just leader. It all seemed too grand, almost unbelievable. But that torn cloak was living proof that it was not a figment of his imagination or a dream. After that remarkable encounter with Ahijah, Jeroboam was no longer the same. Inside, he was certain that something great was about to happen, and it wasn't long before that promise began to be fulfilled. When Solomon died, the throne passed to his son Rehoboam. The hope was that things would improve, but on the contrary, the situation only got worse. Rehoboam, young and lacking wisdom, rejected the advice of the more experienced and decided to weigh even more heavily on the people. That was when Jeroboam saw his chance. He returned from Egypt, where he had fled to escape Solomon's wrath, and soon placed himself as the leader of the popular discontent. The northern tribes, tired and rebellious, broke away from Rehoboam and proclaimed Jeroboam king. What Ahijah had prophesied was coming true before everyone's eyes, as if destiny were simply following a script that had already been written. But then came the irony of history. Jeroboam, who had received the kingdom from the hands of God, began to act as if power depended solely on his cunning. Fearing that the people would reunite with the southern kingdom because of their pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem, he had 2 golden calves made and placed one in Bethel and the other in Dan. "These are the gods who brought you out of Egypt," he announced, repeating the old mistake that had already brought so much suffering to Israel in the past. It was a serious blow to the covenant with God. The people, deceived and perhaps weary of so much instability, followed Jeroboam in this new form of worship. But while the altars were being erected and the sacrifices were being made, an invisible weight began to form in the air. For God's silence is never a sign of forgetfulness, and Jeroboam would soon discover this in the harshest possible way. Years passed, and while the false altars prospered, something began to stir in the heavenly realm. God called Ahijah again, now aged and weary, but still with that prophetic fire burning inside him. The message? Direct and to the point. The kingdom that Jeroboam had received would be shattered, just as he had shattered God's heart with his idolatry. Ahijah was not afraid. Even knowing the power Jeroboam now wielded, he delivered the message without softening a single word, and it was not a simple rebuke. The word was like a hammer blow. Jeroboam's house would be torn down, thrown away like trash, scattered in the field like dung. Yes, those were the exact words. Imagine the weight of that. It wasn't just punishment. It was the final sentence of a dynasty that had begun with promise and was ending in ruin. But it didn't stop there. God made it clear that the people would not escape unscathed either. Israel, which had blindly followed Jeroboam's leadership, would pay dearly. Pain, exile, and destruction would come, and all this because of one choice: to exchange the living God for lifeless statues. Ahijah, even with his voice perhaps already trembling with age, spoke with a strength that could only come from above. The king, who once held those pieces of cloak and dreamed big, now found himself facing a wall that was closing in on him. It was then that the drama ceased to be merely political and invaded the heart of Jeroboam's family. His son, Abijah, fell seriously ill. It was not just a fever, it was an illness that seemed to suck the life out of the boy day after day. Desperate, Jeroboam no longer knew where to turn. He who had placed other gods on the altar now wanted to hear the voice of the true God again. To do so, he came up with a rather strange plan. He sent his wife in disguise to seek an answer from Ahijah. The queen left in a hurry, disguised in simple clothes, hoping that no one would recognize her. The goal was clear: to extract some good prophecy from the old prophet, something that would bring hope. But what she didn't know was that even though he was blind with age, Ahijah could see with eyes that went beyond the physical. God had already told him everything before she even knocked on the door. As soon as the woman entered the house, Ahijah called her by her real name, exposing her attempt to hide the truth. Imagine her shock. And before she could say anything, Ahijah began to deliver the message, and it was not what she wanted to hear. He revealed that the boy would indeed die, but there was a surprising detail. Abijah would be the only one in Jeroboam's house to find peace and receive a proper burial, because God had seen something good in that boy, a glimmer of light amid so much darkness. As the queen listened with a heavy heart, Ahijah continued. The fall of Jeroboam's house was decreed, and nothing could change that. All that remained was to wait for time to bring to light all that was already written. As Jeroboam's wife made her way back home, each step heavier than the last, Ahijah's prophecy continued to echo, as if his words could not be contained by walls or distance. The personal pain of her son's death was only the beginning. Ahijah had spoken of something even more devastating. Israel, the people whom God had delivered with a mighty hand, would be torn from their own land. The image Ahijah used was strong, almost as if he were painting a grim picture. God would uproot Israel as one uproots weeds, leaving no roots behind. The people would be scattered beyond the Euphrates River, far from the promised land, far from the temple, far from everything that gave them their identity. It was a vision of exile, of helplessness, and of a total break with the ancient promise, not because God had failed, but because Israel had chosen to go down another path. Ahijah spoke as if he could already see that future with frightening clarity. He saw empty cities, destroyed temples, men and women taken away as prisoners, carrying only the memory of what they had lost. It was a punishment, yes, but also a warning. God does not tolerate his people playing with sacred things. Hidden sin always finds a way out. After that flood of revelations, something curious happened. Ahijah simply disappeared from public view. There were no more fiery speeches, no dramatic gestures, no prophecies shouted from the rooftops. It was as if he had accomplished everything he needed to do and suddenly vanished into the background of history. No one knows for sure what his last days were like, or where or when he died. It's a strange silence, almost uncomfortable, especially for someone who was so important at decisive moments. But this silence was not empty. It was the kind of heavy silence, full of hidden meanings. AIAH's message had already been cast like a stone into a lake, and the ripples continued to spread, even though he was no longer there to see them. His words, laden with divine weight, were now working on their own, fulfilling themselves little by little, as if history itself were tied to every sentence he had uttered. The people, accustomed to hearing the voice of prophets in times of crisis, now had to deal with his absence. And that absence, in a way, spoke even louder. Every defeat in battle, every internal crisis, every sign of decay was as if to say, "Remember what Ahijah warned you." And even though some tried to forget, it was impossible to erase the trail he had left behind. And while Israel staggered, still insisting on following its own crooked paths, the name of Ahijah remained there, hovering like an invisible shadow over the destiny of the people. For although that prophet had disappeared from the pages of history, the impact of his words was far from over. Even without further appearances, the name of Ahijah did not die with him. On the contrary, the legacy of this prophet grew stronger, almost like invisible roots that deepened in the heart of Israel's history. Ahijah became a symbol of something rare, faithfulness without the spotlight. He was not remembered for spectacular miracles or feats of war, but for something that in the end weighs more than any victory, having been faithful to the voice of God until his last breath. He was the kind of prophet who did not need fame, but who left deep marks. Every word he spoke proved true over time, as if the future itself bowed down to prove his messages right. And that did not go unnoticed. The leaders who came after him, even the most stubborn and distant from God, knew well who Ahijah had been. It was as if his name carried with it an uncomfortable reminder. Be careful. God sees everything. The people did not forget either. With every crisis that erupted, with every bitter defeat, there it was, whispering in the back of the collective mind, Ahijah's message about the consequences of disobedience. Even the prophets who came later, such as Elijah and Elisha, found the ground already prepared by the firm words of that simple man from Shiloh. Without him, much might not have been understood in the same way. And as the people tried to move forward, stumbling through spiritual highs and lows, something curious happened. Even without meaning to, they were shaping a collective memory in which Ahijah was more than a prophet. He became almost a living warning, a constant reminder that God always sends his word before the storm. As generations passed, Ahijah's name became almost mythical. He was no longer just that old man from Shiloh, forgotten by many. Now, he was a symbol. Whenever anyone spoke of the ancient prophecies, there was Ahijah like a shadow cast over the present. It was impossible to ignore the weight of what he had said and how everything had come true to the letter. The kings who rose after him, even those who didn't want to know about God, had to swallow hard every time they remembered his words, because deep down they knew, if Ahijah had spoken, sooner or later, it would happen. It was like distant thunder, that sound that starts softly, but you know a storm is coming. Even among the simplest people, Ahijah became a kind of silent example. Parents told stories about him to their children, not only to remember what had happened to Jeroboam, but to teach something deeper. The word of God does not return empty. Every piece of that torn cloak continued to echo, as if it were still there, reminding everyone that God speaks, and when he speaks, he means it. Time passed, and other prophets arose, each with his own style and mission. But Ahijah remained there, in some corner of the collective memory, always mentioned when people spoke of God's promises and warnings. He became the kind of name that carries not only a story, but also a warning. The story of Ahijah is not just about ancient prophecies, nor is it only about disobedient kings and fallen kingdoms. It is, above all, a living reminder of how God acts and speaks, even when we think he is silent. Ahijah teaches us something simple but powerful. It doesn't matter if we are great or small in the eyes of the world. What matters is that we are faithful to the mission God has placed in our hands. He did not seek glory or try to please kings. The only thing that mattered to Ahijah was obedience, even when the messages were harsh, even when they brought tears and heaviness. He did not back down. This shows that sometimes our mission is not to be applauded, but to be true. What's more, Ahijah reminds us that the choices we make have consequences. Jeroboam was given an incredible opportunity, but he chose to follow his own path. The result: destruction and sadness. How many times do we also receive opportunities and end up wasting them because we think we know better? Another striking point is how God sees beyond appearances. Jeroboam's wife tried to deceive Ahijah with a disguise, but God revealed everything. This makes us think there is no point in pretending before God. He sees the heart. He sees what no one else sees. Finally, the great lesson is that God's word remains, even when everything around us changes. Ahijah was no longer there to see things happen, but the word he spoke remained alive, fulfilling itself at the right time. And today, that same word still challenges us. Are we listening? Are we willing to obey even when it costs us dearly? Because in the end, it is this silent faithfulness that leaves eternal marks. If you enjoyed the story of Ahijah and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.